Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host Ian, and today we're diving into the recessions of the 1980s and the 1990s here in Canada. Let's start with the basics. Canada faced two major recessions in this area. The first hit in 1981 and lasted until 1982, triggered by skyrocketing inflation in the late 1970s. Tightened monetary policy from the Bank of Canada to combat it, and global oil price shocks from events like the Iranian Revolution. Interest rates soared, peaking at over 20% in some cases, which crushed borrowing and spending. The economy contracted sharply and unemployment climbed to almost 13% by late 1982. Then came the early 1990s slump, from 1990 to 1992, which is even more drawn out. High interest rates again, this time to fight persistent inflation combined with the introduction of the Goods and Service Tax, GST, in 1991. A slowdown in global trade and domestic issues like failed constitutional accords. Unemployment peaked again at 12.1% in 1992, and the recovery felt agonizingly slow. But numbers don't really tell the full story. These recessions tore through lives. Let's talk about the mass unemployment. In the 1980s, factories and resource sectors like Alberta's oil industry got hammered. Workers who'd spent decades on assembly lines or in oil fields suddenly found themselves completely out of work. Take a man named Mike Hirsch as an example, a Toronto factory worker profiled by the CBC. With just a grade 9 education and 20 years on that job, he was laid off and struggled to pivot to the growing service sector or tech jobs. Newspapers suggested jobs elsewhere, but for many like him, that meant starting over with no skills to match, leading to months or years of uncertainty. In the 1990s, it was even worse. Over 400,000 jobs vanished in the first year alone, with manufacturing and construction hit hardest. One personal account from the time described federal government layoffs in the 1994, forcing a family to sell their 1986 bungalow at the same price they paid, downgrading to a smaller, semi-detached home that became their base for decades. The parents were so scared by the experience that even in better times, they hesitated to upsize again. These job losses didn't just mean missed paychecks, they fractured families and communities. In Montreal, unemployment reached 16.7% by the late 1992, pushing over 100,000 households onto welfare. Across the country, the shift to part-time or self-employment became a survival tactic, but it meant lower pay and less security. The 1990s recession dragged on, with full-time jobs taking up to 7 years to recover to pre-downturn levels. Imagine being in your prime working years, supporting a family, and watching your industry evaporate. That's what happened to thousands. Now, let's turn to real estate, because these recessions delivered brutal blows to home values and dreams of stability. In the 1980s, those sky-high interest rates, up to 18 to 20%, led to widespread foreclosures. People couldn't renew mortgages without massive payment hikes, and homes sat empty. But the 1990s crash was legendary, especially in hot markets like Toronto. After a late 1980s bubble where prices doubled in places like the GTA, the bottom just fell out. National resale prices dropped about 9.5%, but in Toronto, values plummeted 25 to 35% over 6 years, with some areas seeing 50% losses. Streets in Scarborough had every second house for sale, as renewals at 18% rates forced sales. One tragic story I came across was a family that saw their home value shoot from $200,000 to $700,000 in the 1980s, but refused to sell at that peak and even had an offer at that time. When rates rose and the crash hit, and they had to sell, they couldn't even get $250,000, losing everything, including a business condo they borrowed against. Developers went bankrupt like Olympia in York, and banks teetered, with CIBC needing a bailout. Buyers walked away from condo deposits, leaving builders in the lurch. For homeowners, this meant negative equity, owing more than your house was even worth, and years trapped in underwater mortgages. These economic hits left deep scars, what economists call scarring effects, long-term damage to careers and well-being. Workers who lost jobs in these recessions faced persistent earning losses. Studies show that graduating into a downturn can mean 5% lower earnings over the first 10 years of your career. For young men in the 1990s, unemployment spiked at 15%, and many ended up in underemployed roles, delaying skill building and promotions. Even decades later, health impacts showed. Displaced workers from the 1980s saw life expectancy drop by 1 to 1.5 years. Immigrants bore an even heavier burden. Recent arrivals in the early 1990s saw employment drop 14 percentage points below pre-recession levels for men, versus just 6% for Canadian-born or long-term residents. Earnings fell 24% for immigrant men at the trough. The 1992 immigrant cohort earned 13% less than the 1988 group, even 20 years later. These recessions hit low seniority workers hardest, and immigrants often start there. Plus, the 1990s saw cuts to unemployment insurance, leaving only 45% of unemployed men eligible for benefits, down from 85% in prior downturns. This vulnerability amplified mental health strains, family stress, and delayed integration. The pain spilled into politics, culminating in the 1993 federal election, a total upheaval. The progressive conservatives under Brian Mulroney and then Kim Campbell were blamed for the recession's depth. They hated GST and botched constitutional talks like Meats Lake and Charlottetown. Voter anger was fierce. The PCs, who held a majority, crashed to just 2 seats, losing official party status. Jean Chrétien's Liberals swept with 177 seats while new parties rose. The Reform Party in the West, tapping fiscal conservative frustrations, and the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, fueling sovereignty debates. It was a wipeout that reshaped Canadian politics, showing how economic hardship can topple governments. The NDP also tanked, dropping to 9 seats. Mulroney resigned amid record low approval, and the PCs never fully recovered, eventually merging into today's Conservatives. Recovery wasn't quick or painless. In the 1980s, it took about 4 years for full-time jobs to rebound, driven partly by domestic investment in infrastructure. The 1990s dragged longer, 7 years for jobs. But free trade with the US in 1989 helped open markets, though it cost some manufacturing roles. That all said, by the late 1990s, the economy started to boom again, but the scars lingered. A trend toward precarious work, higher household debt, and caution in real estate. Many families adopted a waited out mindset during crashes, holding onto homes through negative equity for a decade. Overall, these recessions remind us that economic downturns aren't just stats, they're stories of resilience amid loss. They highlight the need for strong safety nets like better EI coverage and the risk of over-leveraged housing. Now, as we navigate today's uncertainties, remember, markets recover, but preparation matters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.